We're officially live for the second meeting, I believe described as meeting 1B in the parlance of our rulemaking. So welcome. We'll give, again, a couple more minutes for folks to come in. For folks that already have heard me say this a couple times, if you're a RAC member, if you could please rename yourself. That includes RAC member. That would be really helpful. Raise your hand or let us know if you need some help being renamed. Generally, you just hover over your name or your box and click on the ellipses, rename, and you can rename yourself. So we'll give another minute for folks to make their way into the community with us, and then we'll slowly work through our opening and welcome folks in as they join, and then really move through what is a pretty robust agenda for today.
And Ben, there seems to be a bit of an issue with live stream, so I'm just going to check with our IT and let you know they get it fixed.
Need the world to be able to see us, so we'll give a minute or two so we can make sure public has access to the conversation. So I'll let Ingrid do her work. So I guess if you want a glass of water or whatever else is going to help sustain you until our first break. We did build in 2 breaks this time, so we're already iterating to make sure that we've accounted for everyday human needs of not staring at a screen for 3 hours uninterrupted. And so Ingrid, I'll just, when you give me the heads up that we're able to go live recorded, then we'll start formally.
According to Casaria, it's working. It's just, I can't see it, but go ahead.
Okay. I guess we've been live. So anyways, well, let's dive in. Thank you, Ingrid. So I want to welcome everyone. It's our second Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting. We do have a pretty packed agenda today and a lot to cover. So I'm going to kind of dive right in. And if, again, just if folks want to make sure, RAC members in particular, if you can change your name to designate that you're a Rulemaking Advisory Committee or RAC, that would be really helpful. If you want to add organizational affiliation, pronouns, all of those things are helpful, both for me as a facilitator, for the public engaging, and for you all when referring to each other. I do, we have a lot of folks here, and I know we did introductions at the last meeting. I do want to call some folks in. If you weren't at our first meeting, I would love to open the floor and have you introduce yourself to your fellow RAC members. It's testing my memory a little bit. Maxine, I don't believe you were at the last meeting. Could you jump in and say hello to everybody? You're on mute though, so we got to unmute you. It should be one of 2 places. On the bottom left of your screen, there's a little microphone. I also think I can click ask to unmute and see if that makes it helpful. Ingrid, do we have the capacity to unmute people for them?
Let me try it. Hold on.
Let's come back. We'll come back to you, Maxine. We're going to work on getting you sound, get your sound into the world here. Is there anybody else who was not at the first meeting? If you could raise your hand. Yeah, Anna, please jump in.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see everyone. Anna Molina, she, her pronouns. I'm the Advocacy and Systems Director for Oregon Just Transition Alliance. We're a statewide member alliance working on just transition principles, and happy to be here with y'all. We were part of the stakeholder group for the ONA process, so wanting to see that follow through here in the Rules Advisory Committee.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. Good to see you. Ariel.
Hi, everyone, and I apologize, I'm sick, so I'm off camera today. My name is Ariel Nelson, she, her pronouns. I missed the first meeting. I'm with the League of Oregon Cities. Thanks for having me as part of this process.
Great to have you. Welcome. Any others that were at our last meeting? Have we sorted? Maxine, are you dialing in maybe now? Says, hold on. All right, well, we will bring Maxine in. Let's pull up the slides, and when we figure out how to hear Miss Maxine, we'll make sure that she has a chance to introduce herself to the group. So welcome everyone, and I know we'll have other chances to get to know each other as we go through this process. And again, with so many people in the room, didn't want to just take our valuable time walking through. So if we go to the next slide, we're gonna look at another reminder, please change your names. So I think I'm seeing most folks already have. If we go next slide, I'm gonna walk through the agenda. And really today is building upon the conversation and the work that we did in our first meeting, continuing to ground ourselves in the bigger picture of what ultimately we are tasked to do as a rulemaking body. We're gonna start with an overview of goals 10 and 14 and create some space for this group to ask clarifying questions on that relationship of land use goals and the work that we're doing. And then we're going to move into a discussion of the legislation that guides the scope of our rulemaking. We are going to take a break. As I said, we'll have a couple breaks through our time together. And then we're going to do a quick tutorial on some technology that we're going to utilize throughout our time together. So I don't know if folks are familiar with mural boards, but I'll give you a little tutorial. With this many people in the room, it's going to be one of many mechanisms that we're going to try to utilize to ensure that everyone's voices can continue to show up. And then we're going to dive into some areas of specificity and really introduce the Rulemaking Advisory Committee to some of the work that's going to be happening in our technical advisory committees, what you will hear as RACs and TACs. And there's some wonderful names that you'll also hear, the How TAC and the NAC TAC and some other things that you'll hear about later. But really trying to make sure that folks walk out of today understanding those intersections of the work that we're doing, the high level policy guidance and legislative direction, and the more intimate and specific details that technical groups will be working on. And then we'll close with a recap and some expectations and communications for next steps. If you go to the next slide. And then just a couple things as we move into the day. One, for folks that weren't at our last meeting, we will ground ourselves once again in this beautiful mosaic, as I say, around some of what we imagine this work to be about and what brings us to this space. So you can see the word cloud that was generated by you and your peers at our last meeting. And we're going to continue to ensure that our work really has the ability to vision together, while also, as many folks said in the last meeting, holding and balancing the tensions and the complexity of what we're trying to achieve and the realities of what it actually looks like on the ground. Sean, did you want to jump in?
Oh, no.
Oh, I just saw the unmute. See, this is a facilitator. I start seeing that unmute. I feel like you're going to jump in. So as we walk out of today, we hope that you have a shared understanding of the foundations. We're going to provide some high-level overviews of baseline information that guides land use in the state, the legislative direction, that really is part of our unique opportunity to reimagine land use and housing in our state. And recognize, just as we, to preface this whole conversation, I want to recognize, right, there's folks in this room who have studied, worked on, been kind of intimately connected to this work for many, many years. And there's others that are in some ways being introduced through this process to the real technical elements and the policy elements of this work. So as we go through today, we're going to create some space for clarifying questions. But as you see here, I just want folks to remember, and please utilize, if you're kind of coming into this work without that kind of depth of expertise, or you have questions or concerns that you want to share outside of this room, please utilize the drop-in meeting on the 18th. We're going to build this as part of our process going forward, and I hope and expect that it's a really valuable tool and space for folks to be able to have deeper dialogue with other subject matter experts. So certainly, if you're someone who wants to engage more deeply to understand background or ask questions, there's no agenda. It's really just driven by you. Please utilize that space. Maxine, I see you're off mute. Can we hear you? Let's see.
Yes, I can hear you. Absolutely.
And I can hear you. Can you say hello and introduce yourself to your peers here?
Okay, sure. Not as formal as I've heard everyone else do, but my name is Maxine Fitzpatrick. And actually, I do have a little small consulting firm, but I won't go into details of that. But what I do really enjoy and want to be a part of is addressing the homeless and housing, affordable housing that exists in the state, and better share with what I understand why it exists and some of the things that we may be able to do to address it. I'm not really a noted expert, but I do have a fair sense of what we can do, and that's from the years that I've spent primarily working in affordable housing, both rental and home ownership. So I'm really honored to be a part of this team. So thank you.
No, thank you. And I know that we'll all benefit from that wisdom and expertise that you bring from such a career in the work. So thank you. Any questions around what we're trying to achieve before we kind of dive into the substance of the discussion? Hey, not seeing any. I think we can go to the next slide. Sean, I think I'm passing it to you, right? Yes.
Yes. And sorry, I was trying to subtly unmute there so there wouldn't be that lag between when you're doing the transition. But I failed to do that. So, but thanks, Ben. Thanks for the handoff. And I want to pick up right where Ben was leaving off on, talking about the different perspectives that we have here on the RAC. And we were thinking a lot about how we wanted to structure this meeting, especially in light of where we're trying to get to. And we know that we need to do some scaffolding today, right? Like we need to talk about some of the basic ideas of like what our legislative direction is. We need to talk about some grounding and like what are the areas of the statewide land use planning program, which I'll talk about in a minute, are we going to be focusing on as part of this process. And it raised this kind of balance that we thought was important to communicate to all of you all as RAC members that we're going to be continuing to deal with throughout this rulemaking process, right? There's this balance that we have to achieve. So everybody in this room, the reason you're on the RAC is because you have a deep expertise that is going to help operationalize the legislative direction that was included in House Bill 2001 and 2889, right? Some folks have expertise that is very much kind of at the high level, thinking about like, be it advocacy, be it lived experience, right? There's so much value and necessity in that perspective. And at the same time, we also have folks who have been living and breathing this, the Goal 10 and Goal 14 process, which we'll again talk about in a minute, for decades, right? And there's this kind of, right, when we're talking about rulemaking, both of these things are going to be incredibly important for the purposes of having a successful rulemaking, but we have to make choices in our meetings about where we spend our time, right? If we try to have conversations where we get all into this nitty gritty in the weed details, we're going to lose a lot of people and we're going to spend a lot of time talking at you, right? And so one of the things that we're trying to do as part of this is have a balance, right? Try to keep things at a sufficiently high level, give you guys the resources that you need to know to be able to engage in the conversation, to be able to provide your feedback and your expertise, while at the same time kind of balancing that and knowing that we need to get into the weeds and into the details to really kind of make sure that this policy is successful. And to us, this is kind of a shared responsibility between both our groups. We've done a lot before this meeting to really try and kind of scaffold and set folks up with, rather than handing you just the text of the bill, trying to provide a plain language summary, trying to provide a, short summary of the breakdowns of issues that we need to grapple with as part of this rulemaking. That is going to be an ongoing commitment from us. We need to be able to provide that as a team to you all. But at the same time, in order for us to like facilitate conversation, we can't be presenting on all of this information again and again, right? We would be spending a lot of time or most of our time presenting if we did that. So it's going to be very important at the same time for RAC members, right, to kind of take those materials, and make sure that they're prepared coming into this meeting, so that way we're able to facilitate a meaningful discussion. And of course, in addition to this, we're still thinking through, like, we need to have other types of scaffolding, say things like office hours or venues where people can come and, kind of ask us different questions that we're definitely working on standing up that we think is important. But we just want to indicate, start off right off the bat, that this is going to be a continuing balance as part of this rulemaking. And we made some decisions to keep a lot of this presentation at a very high level, with the expectation that, we provided these materials and that you guys have, grappled with them, and that will be, that will leave more time for discussion, right? So I just wanted to start with that, and get that out of the way right at the beginning. And I want to start by moving into our first kind of element of the scaffolding, which is about what we will be largely focusing on as part of this rulemaking, which relates to specifically goals 10 and goal 14. Just kind of like a basics, like what are these goals? What is the statewide land use planning program? How have we operationalized this, and how is this changing? And we're going to start with this kind of scaffolding, so that way we can talk about, some of the issues that we need to dive into. To back up to like the 100-foot level, goals 10 and goal 14, which I'll talk in more detail about in a minute, are part of 19 goals that our agency, DLCD, and our commission, LCDC, are kind of tasked with stewarding and implementing for the entire state of Oregon. They express different responsibilities to plan for and to, work towards different goals that we have around, say, things like working lands, around things like environmental protections, around kind of natural hazards preventions, coastal resources, all these different areas of a lot of goals that we have. And we've had this system kind of implemented since the 1970s. And part of that includes a series of goals around urbanization, what happens inside of cities, to ensure that we develop in kind of a timely and orderly fashion, and that we're responding to the needs of Oregonians that live in our communities. And that includes goals 10 and goal 14. I'll start with goal 10. This is the goal, the statewide land use planning goal on housing, right? This text at the top, don't worry about reading it, I'll explain it, is the kind of core foundation of what goal 10 is trying to achieve. This is like the auspices of goal 10. And if you kind of dive into it, essentially what this goal articulates is a responsibility that, kind of at the state and local level, we have an obligation to plan for an abundance and diversity of affordable housing options for residents that live in our communities, right? And it's a kind of affirmative obligation that exists in the statute. Now, one thing that we're going to be talking about as we go through this is that we are changing from a historic focus on how we've implemented goal 10. We're not changing the language itself, but we are changing the focus of how that goal has been implemented over time. And I want to start with a little bit of a historic perspective on how we've historically implemented goal 10. And you can see this kind of simplified in this graphic below here. If you were to look at this graphic, this would be what we would describe goal 10 just before the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Policy was implemented in 2023. Everything that you see on the left part of this graphic here, everything in blue, this is the historic implementation of goal 10. Like if you went back to the 1970s, this is what a local government would do to demonstrate that they have met the requirements of goal 10. And as we'll talk about in a minute, this left half of the graphic in front of you is very much an exercise about land. It's really focused on, all right, we have these urban growth boundaries that are intended to accommodate 20 years of growth. We plan for a growing population. Do we have enough land to accommodate that growth over the next 20 years? Yes or no? And that's kind of the focus of that particular element of goal 10, right? It's very narrow. It's very focused just on how much land you have and what is it zoned to. Now, kind of recognizing that limitation or that narrow focus of goal 10, in 2019, there was a bill called House Bill 2003 that implemented a new requirement. And that's what you see on the right here in green. This is what's called the Housing Production Strategy. And the way that we describe this to folks, and we'll talk again more about the details of both of these documents in a minute, we describe this as a game plan that a local government adopts that articulates all of the actions that they want to take over the next 6 years inside the metro or 8 years outside of the metro that they're going to take to promote the development of housing over time. Right. So it's kind of that, it's a much broader range of actions. It's not just focused on land and zoning, but a much broader range of tools that local governments have access to. But it is focused at the local implementation level. And all of this, House Bill 2003 also kind of put this on a regular 6 to 8 year cycle, which was not previously the case. It was, I won't go into the details about that, but it established a regular cycle by which these plans are updated over time. All right. So that's kind of the historic where we were at right before the bill. When the bill was adopted, it didn't change these major components, right? So local governments are still doing largely housing capacity analyses and housing production strategies. But what it did was kind of change the focus of the implementation of the goal to not just be about, say, land and production strategies, but really to focus on working towards housing production, affordability, and choice, and to affirmatively further fair housing, right? So thinking about a different focus for how we implement Goal 10 to get us closer to goals that we have around production, affordability, and choice. And really, what you can kind of see in this graphic, this modified graphic right over here, is it doesn't really change the requirements that a local government has of, planning for need, planning the amount of land they have in a housing capacity analysis, or planning their actions in a housing production strategy. But it really does kind of change internally how those focus on different elements. And at the broad outset, at the state level, really tasking the state with a much broader role in terms of setting the parameters. Like, what is the need that we're planning for, right? That is a responsibility of the state now. What are the goals that we're striving for? The production targets, right? The state sets those expectations. And then when we're not meeting our goals, we're going to, track and evaluate outcomes. When we're not meeting our goals, the state has kind of a role in tracking and evaluating what are the barriers that are inhibiting us from actually achieving those outcomes that we want to achieve, right? So thinking about this as a much more holistic long-term policy rather than just this kind of narrow exercise that just only happens at the local level once every 6 or 8 years, right? Okay, so moving on from that, I want to talk about the individual local requirements themselves. Both the housing capacity analysis that I mentioned previously, and then the housing production strategy. Let's start with the housing capacity analysis. I mentioned this in a previous slide. The entire focus of this document is about how much land a city has within their urban growth boundary to accommodate need, right? The way this works is a city, they have kind of two sides of the equation. One is the need side of the equation. How much housing do we need over the next 20 years? And then the other side of the equation is how much land do we have and what's its zone capacity, right? And kind of a comparison of those two things is what comprises a housing capacity analysis. So on the needs side, and one thing I should mention, this is changing, right? This is one of the things that's changing as part of this policy. We need to talk through how we operationalize it. And we'll talk about that once we get into the policy issues. But one of the changes here is that local governments will now receive kind of an allocation of need. The state does a full statewide analysis of need every year. That's called the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. They divide the state into regions. They estimate the full need and account for housing that's needed right now, as well as needed in the future. And then they allocate that need down to individual local governments, right? So everybody is going to receive a share of the overall need of the state, right? So every community has kind of a portion of the overall need, right? And from there, right, they receive a number of housing units and they receive affordability levels, right? So, different housing types are affordable to different households. They'll have a kind of overall share of that. So 0 to 30, 30 to 60. I won't go into the details of it, but it's planning for affordable housing as well as kind of market rate housing. And Shannon, I see your hand up. We'll take questions right at the end. Yeah, but keep it up. That's fine. From there, cities then take those allocations that are provided to them. They translate that into the types, characteristics, and location of housing that they would plan for over the next 20 years, right? So you think about like, all right, what's the mix of housing units that we're going to be planning for? What is, say, the size of housing? Say the accessibility. Do we want to support, housing that can age in place? All the different characteristics. Do we want housing that's close to schools or jobs, right? These are all kind of decisions that need to be made at the local level. It's kind of a translation that they do. And then after they do that, they go through a process to inventory all of the lands that exist within their urban growth boundary. So getting all the land that's within their urban growth boundary, characterizing whether it's kind of developed or whether it's available for development, characterizing its zoning, whether it's constrained in any way, and kind of estimating, hey, based on all this information that we have about this land, how much housing would we expect to be built on this land over the next 20 years, right? And so once they do both of these two sides of the equation, they then compare those. Do we have enough land zoned to the appropriate capacity to accommodate 20 years of growth? And if there is totally enough land, then it's fine. They don't have to do any additional action as part of this particular document. But if they have a deficiency, if they have a shortage of the amount of land that they need to accommodate 20 years of growth, they're required to do something about it. Specifically, they're required to do one of two things. One is adopt efficiency measures, which is a way of saying, it's a bureaucratic way of saying growing in or up. So, allowing more housing on less land inside the urban growth boundary. And then also an urban growth boundary adjustment. And generally, local governments need to do some combination of these two things to accommodate need. All right. I'm going to move on to talking about the housing production strategy. Again, at the high level, I mentioned that this was kind of a 6 or 8 year game plan where a city articulates everything that they're going to do over the next 6 or 8 years to support the production of housing. One change is now this also requires cities to demonstrate how they are also affirmatively furthering fair housing too, right? So there's this kind of explicit nexus with fair and equitable housing outcomes that has now been articulated as part of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis policy. And it consists of a lot of different components, right? One is a contextualized housing needs analysis. So thinking about needs of different community members, say people with disabilities, say communities of color, say thinking about housing quality, market characteristics, a lot of different, kind of subtle in the weeds differences or details about like how that need is not just, a number of housing units, right? A second component of this is engagement. So talking with your community members, talking with, say, builders or people who live in your community about what their needs are, what the barriers that they see are, right, is an important part of this, and kind of meshing that into strategy is an important piece of this. Getting into the strategies, what a local government is actually going to do and what's the timeline that they're going to do those things is a major component of this document, right? The core or heart of this program. And then in our rules, we also articulate a series of fair and equitable housing outcomes that local governments kind of need to demonstrate that their strategies in total are really working towards achieving things like fair housing or housing choice or addressing affordable rental and homeownership needs, addressing homelessness, right? These are all components of the fair and equitable housing outcomes section, right? All right, so that's the housing production strategy. So I mentioned previously in the housing capacity analysis that when a city identifies a deficiency, right, there's two approaches that they can take. One is efficiency measures. The other is an urban growth boundary adjustment. When you get into an urban growth boundary adjustment, that takes you over to Goal 14. And to talk about Goal 14, I'm going to invite my colleague Karen Guijen-Chapman to talk through the steps of how an urban growth boundary adjustment occurs. Karen, are you on?
I think I'm ready. Thank you.
Yeah.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, folks. Karen Guijen-Chapman, Karen as well. That's just fine. I serve as the UGB specialist for DLCD. Sean mentioned that your housing capacity analysis is really looking at, do we have enough land? Is it zoned to sufficient capacity to accommodate the needed growth over 20 years? And then the urban growth boundary is a series of analysis or studies to determine if a city, how they might grow, where they might grow, and where they, to really meet that identified housing need. So where and how they might grow. I'll be really brief for the sake of time. I think we're going a little bit over, but there's 3 major studies looking at a preliminary study area or where they want to consider these growths. This involves excluding lands that may not be practicable, lands that may have natural hazards, or lands with specific designations of natural resource, scenic, cultural, recreation, or otherwise. So you're really looking at, let's take a big broad brush of where we could grow, do some exclusions, prioritize down. And then the state has a hierarchy or a scheme for prioritization of lands. There are cities in the state that have urban reserves. These are always first up in priority. Some jurisdictions might have what's designated as marginal lands. And then certainly there's farm and forest lands, and those are designated between high value primary farmlands or class 1, 2, 3, and 4, depending on the classification. It's the preservation of the highest, most valuable lands. Those predominantly will be least priority in the scheme to bring into urbanization and development. Lastly, a jurisdiction will go through their location factors, looking at our alternatives of where is it most efficient to accommodate for this growth, what it might look like for the provision of facilities, water, sewer, roads, infrastructure, and how to do that. and then some comparative analysis around the energy, economic, and social consequences that may happen of growing into a new area adjacent to their current urban growth boundary, and then looking at compatibility, what is adjacent and how that growth might be compatible with what currently exists to where they're growing. Once these factors are all analyzed, I think that is when a jurisdiction might put together their urbanization program of this is where we'd like to expand and how much and how that will meet their identified housing needs for that 20-year planning period. I think that about covers the basics of where we're at with goal 14 in our system. But I think we have time. We put a lot of information out there. Goal 10, our housing planning goal, goal 14, our urbanization goal, are any of the material that Sean and I have covered if there are questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Just clarify anything.
Yeah, clarifying question. Shannon, I know you had a hand, just remembering, right, you're not going to catch up on what's probably some people's 20 years of work in this field in a 15-minute presentation. So just clarifying questions, and there'll be other opportunities to get grounded in some of the background. But Shannon, jump in, please.
Yeah, I think I'd appreciate just a quick understanding of in the land analysis, to what extent do municipalities sort of get to like grade, I want to say, available land? Like, is it privately owned or publicly owned? Are there like huge structural issues, even though it's inside a buildable area? Do you kind of see like how refined does that assessment get to be is my question.
Yeah, Shannon, I can speak to that a little bit. And so one of our jobs, and we'll talk about this in the issues area, is kind of highlighting a bunch of ways that local governments can take into account different considerations and have certainty, you know, that what they do is going to be kind of sanctioned under state law. But in short, the way that local governments approach it, when they look at all of the land that exists inside their UGB, they characterize, you know, the expected likelihood of whether it would develop over 20 years. And there's this legal standard that exists in there called substantial evidence. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it kind of gives local governments some deference to, you know, provided you have evidence about a particular assumption on a parcel, right? There's kind of some deference given to that local government's determination, provided that there's evidence to support it, right? So they consider, right, how likely is it that this land's going to develop? Are there any constraints that might inhibit it? And then, of course, you know, what's its zoning? And based on these kind of different factors, based on the best available information that they have, would they expect that to develop over a 20-year horizon or not? And part of our job is going to be getting into, right, what are those specific things? There's a lot of ways that you can do it, and we want to provide certainty and clarity to local governments and how they do that.
Yep, thank you for that. Brian?
Hello, everyone. Lower my hand here. I know it's, I appreciate that. Really, it's a very artful summary of very complex rule and law. Excuse me, I'm recovering from COVID. I'm wondering if you could touch on a couple other points related to UGB expansion and some of the other goals. So what comes to mind of the priority statute really affects how urban growth boundaries are expanded in the options allowed or given to, provided to different cities. And then the other one would be just quickly touching on how some of the other goals treat UGB expansions, like goal 5, natural historical resources, and in particular goal 12 and transportation, and I think it's 11, kind of forget my goals sometimes, but around public infrastructure, just at a high level, you know, how those interact with the process of urbanization, because it's not just goal 14, it's how goal 14 is touching on these other goals. And if it's too much for now, that's fine, but I think
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot there, Brian, but I wonder, Sean, maybe if you could take a first run at it, but also just like, what are some of the other things? And maybe we come back to this later around some of the other things that will have to be considered, you know, whether it's goal 5 and 12, how does that connect to the work that this RAC is doing? But I'll let you go where you go with that, but there's probably a lot of depth that we won't be
Yeah.
able to get to them.
Yeah, I want to be sensitive to the time and depth. So, Brian, I would definitely encourage reaching out, like, so we can get you a more detailed response. But I just want to acknowledge that, like, goal 14, right? When we talk about different areas related to goal 14, all of the goals intersect, right? And they all kind of play with each other, right? So, when you're doing a BLI, you remove lands that are protected under goal 5 as an example, because they're, protected and unavailable for development, right? That type of thing. We will be able to talk through that as it relates to our kind of statutory direction. You also touched on the priority scheme. So the priority scheme, as kind of Karin at a high level mentioned, there's an order that the legislature has established by which you bring in lands into the urban growth boundary based on, based on its status. Essentially, the premise is that you want to bring in kind of high value working land, so like high value farmland or forest lands last, right? And you start with lands that are less kind of high value for those types of purposes. That is prescribed in statute, right? That order, that way that priority system is set up is prescribed in statute. One of the things that we have to talk about in the scope of this rulemaking is we can't change what the legislature has prescribed in statute, but we do have the ability to evaluate, all right, where do our rules intersect with these? How can we make sure that this is workable? And let's evaluate how we implement the broader legislative direction. So that's my response for now. I would definitely encourage a written response for follow-up. I just want to be sensitive to time.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So unless there's any burning questions, I'd like to move us on to the next section. And again, we're going to have lots of time over the course of our work together to dive more deeply into all of these. And again, if you're wondering, what the heck is a marginal property? There's things that create those, utilize the spaces that we created. So Ethan, am I passing it to you now? Yeah, please jump in.
I believe so, Ben. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the manager of the Housing Division at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Really good discussion already in this meeting. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation here. I'm going to go through a couple slides here and really talk about, kind of follow up from the first Rulemaking Advisory Committee where we talked about the legislative context. We talked about ONA, we talked about HB 2001 and 2889, but we thought it might be useful to kind of talk through a little bit more detail of like what the scope of this process actually is. So really, this section is going to be kind of highlighting what we're on task to tackle here and, what things are outside of our authority, outside of the span of control in this process. So that's what we're working through in this next little section here. If we could advance the slide. So backing up, I think this is a slide that I think we presented at the last meeting, but it's important to kind of set up the context here. So really, HB 2001 is the culmination of several years of work and conversation around kind of the reform or the update of the Goal 10 process to reflect the system that's really more responsive to the community needs of the state of Oregon and the folks who live here. HB 2001 and kind of the technical cleanup bill, HB 2889, incorporates many, but not all, as you can see here, of the recommendations that came out of the ONA process that DLCD and OHCS and others have engaged stakeholders with over the course of the last couple of years. So next slide. Really, at a really, really high level here, this is my elevator pitch for the ONA. HB 2001 fundamentally includes two elements, right? Establish a methodology for how cities in the state can better estimate and analyze the true and accurate depiction of our housing needs by incorporating elements of that process, of that analysis that we didn't consider as part of the planning process previously. So things like, as you can see here on the far left side of this graphic, projected need under production, units lost to second vacation homes, and housing for people experiencing homelessness, right? Those bottom three are new elements to the way that cities are analyzing their housing need or responding to their housing need. So this directive lands within the scope of OHCS and the Department of Administrative Services through the Office of Economic Analysis, OEA, and DLCD is playing an advisory role to this process. So this methodology is not within the scope of our rulemaking process here. Next slide. Second, and more relevant to this group here in this committee, is the directive to integrate this new planning, analysis, and program, the ONA, right, into the existing statewide planning program. So this is what Sean was talking about before, the Goal 10 and the Goal 14 process primarily. And really, this is where we get the directive for those major, those three major topic area. So in order to integrate ONA into the statewide planning program, we need to answer specific questions about, what it means to plan for new housing units and the allocations, what it means to not participate in the process if a local government opts out of that process or is not taking good faith actions to that process, what happens, how this might impact, the manner in which cities plan for growth, both at the UGB level, but also at the infrastructure level. Next slide, please. So the process that state agencies often engage in through the rulemaking process is really intended to flesh out, the rough skeleton, I guess, that the legislature provides and they articulate in statute through principles, directions, and priorities. So as you can see, yeah, thank you, perfect transition. As you can see, some of those are articulated right here in statute, specific section citations shown on the screen here. These principles, directions, and priorities are the statutory obligations of the Land Conservation and Development Commission to fulfill once we, as a collective, the DLCD team and the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, recommend and advise those rules to eventually be adopted by LCDC. So next slide. So that's a big, big task, right? Those are a lot of obligations, a lot of direction, a lot of principles, a lot of priorities. And with such a big task in front of them, LCDC further articulates their kind of expectations and their own priorities in this process in the form of this rulemaking charge, right? We talked about this last time. And they're refining that broader direction that they're provided or that they've been given by the Oregon legislature through these kind of elements of this charge, right? Safe and accessible, climate resilient. Those are further refinements of those principles that are articulated in statute. So next slide. All right. So this all leads back, right? Those principles, direction, guidelines, priorities, these all lead back to our major tasks as part of this work, the major tasks at hand. And to answer those kind of fundamental questions, right? Like the true direction to LCDC about the things that they need to answer in this process, we need to be putting into action those priorities and policies. Obviously these are huge topics in their own right, and maybe could have in a perfect world, have their own separate rulemaking advisory committee process. But here we are, we're doing all three of them, and we'll talk about all three of these in much more detail in the latter part of this conversation today. But really, I kind of want to show that this is a big task, and there are so many threads, a seemingly endless number of threads that connect and are interwoven into all of these, into these three major topic areas. And we kind of need to be a little bit realistic with ourselves about what we can accomplish here. And so let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. All right. So what are those kind of major strings? Well, we've got some of that is kind of defined, and there are other issues that are part of this process that aren't explicitly directed as part of HB 2001, but are going to be important in determining how we proceed in implementing those major policy areas. So here are some examples. For example, how do we treat how does the interrelationship between metro cities and those urban unincorporated areas within metro, what are the obligations to participate in the Goal 10 planning process for those specific jurisdictions? How is that different or the same or completely tangential to for small and capacity constrained jurisdictions? For example, we heard in the last meeting a couple of weeks ago about Senate Bill 406 and the efforts of Tillamook County to kind of engage in this process. Obviously, they're coming from a different perspective than the rest of the state, considering they're much smaller jurisdictions at large and even a county thrown in there. How do we integrate the conversations that DLCD and stakeholders have been having around the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking? How do we ensure that ONA, CFEC are working in conjunction and are not in conflict is going to be an important element of this process. And finally, how does this work interact with the work of the governor's office and the governor on the housing production package through the legislature? So those are some kind of identified, obviously not exhaustive list of some of those additional things that are, satellites around this HB 2001 issue and are going to be important in us addressing and tackling head on. So one final slide here to show, and this is my favorite one of the slide show here. So I think it really kind of puts in perspective the task that we have in front of us, right? The housing crisis and addressing the housing crisis is going to require a suite of solutions, right? And in our view, HB 2001 and in the view of the legislature and LCDC, HB 2001 and 2889, the ONA, is just one piece of that solution set. So we have to make sure that we are keeping our eyes on the prize, so to speak, and explore the complexity and pull at some of those threads. But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that we're tackling and abiding by the scope of the legislature and the direction that we have from the Land Conservation and Development Commission to make good on those statutory obligations, right? Those are can not to be missed obligations in this process. So I'm going to leave it there. I think we've got some time for clarifying questions and even some discussion here about, what's in, what's out, but I'm going to hand this off to Ben to facilitate that discussion.
Thank you for that, Ethan. So let's take a few minutes. So certainly clarifying questions. And then I think that last slide, certainly there's kind of the big circle. There's the specificity around rulemaking. And I think this is a chance to get some clarity around what about this, what about that? And so really thinking about what's coming up for you or any clarifying questions for Ethan. So open it up to folks to go in either direction.
And I'll stop share so we can see each other.
Great. So really thinking about what else do we need to consider, or what are you curious about whether or not we're in that little circle or the big circle?
And Ben, too, if I could just kind of add, I think we'll have deeper conversation with the rest of the DLCD team about, specifics around those major policy areas. And I think, after that conversation, that might spark some thoughts in your brain here. And thankfully, we've got the post-meeting survey to kind of follow up. And as you're, reflecting on this meeting and after you hear that conversation, you might be able to respond in that survey as well.
Thanks, Ethan. And of course, we're going to dive in more detail around housing accountability, need and production, capacity, urbanization later in our agenda. But let's just open it up if folks have any comments, thoughts, or reflections for what Ethan just shared.
Hey, I had a question. I was just curious if someone could speak to a little bit more, if this is the appropriate space for this, but kind of how OHCS is going to be integrated into this process and kind of where that falls into our scope. Thanks.
Yeah, Ethan?
Yeah, really good question. So particularly on kind of that second element, right? How does the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis get integrated into the statewide planning program, right? OHCS is playing an advisory role, much like DLCD is playing an advisory role to the methodology elements of this work. And thankfully, we've got an OHCS representative, ex officio member as part of this work here. I believe I haven't looked at the list of participants here, but Megan Bolton, if you're here, please do wave. But our process here in terms of making sure that both of those two arms of this ONA implementation work is that we have to be in close coordination. And those folks from OHCS are part of our regular project team meetings, and we're going to be working with them quite a bit on just the conversations around the methodology. And not saying that we should necessarily get into their process, but I think there are lessons to be learned from how DLCD is engaging in OHCS process and how OHCS is engaging in the DLCD process. We can cross learn throughout the next year and a half together. So
Yeah, thanks for that.
Can I add too?
Sean, jump in.
Yeah, and just so you know too, Julia, OHCS has a few kind of responsibilities under this statute. One is that they have to develop, in consultation with us, a series of recommendations to the Department of Administrative Services on the ONA methodology. So, like, what that methodology looks like and its, kind of official form. There is a housing production dashboard, right? This is where we articulate the targets, we track and evaluate how many units are we building, all that type of stuff that they have to develop. And they also have to develop this kind of equity indicators aspect to it too, where they're considering all these different dimensions of equity and outcomes as they relate to the implementation of the ONA. So they have a huge role. They're going to be kind of forming their own process around it. It's going to be kind of happening in parallel to our rulemaking, but we're kind of coordinating with each other to make sure that we have, kind of these two conversations talking to each other, not just happening in silos. So that's just to make that clear.
All right, thank you both. Questions for the moment? Okay. Well, this will not be your last chance to ask questions about the scope and the work that's in front of us. So why don't we take a quick break? It's 1:52 on my clock. If we could just take 5 minutes, and then when we come back together, we're going to dive into a little more detail and more depth into what you were just introduced to. So let's take 5, and we'll come back at 1:57. Thanks all. 5 minutes goes by quickly. Um, So welcome back. If folks can, quick camera on or a thumbs up or raise hand, something that just tells me you're back. Thank you. If I can see your face, then I know you're back. So that's the easiest way to do it. Seeing mostly thumbs ups. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we have, most of us back. Thank you all. If we could pull up the slides, we're going to move into the next part of our conversation. So I'm going to start with, a little tutorial here. So we're going to have a conversation that we're moving into, that's going to dive deeper into the three areas that Ethan was just referencing around accountability, housing needs and production, and housing capacity, and excuse me, urbanization. And there's going to be a couple ways that we're going to move through this conversation. And the first is I want to introduce you to a tool, Miro. I hope some folks have utilized some tools like this, but I'm going to give you a quick tutorial. I'm also going to acknowledge two things. One, at any time, you can use the chat as a way to input information. And we will also open this up for discussion. So don't feel like this is the only mechanism that you have to respond. But with Miro, and we're going to put a link in the chat from Ellen that will take you to this board. I'm going to walk through just a couple things really quickly that will be really helpful. So this is a virtual whiteboard. So if you can imagine, right, if we were all in person and you had a bunch of sticky notes and you could write your sticky note and put it on the wall, it's a mechanism to try to mimic that process, where it allows folks to kind of contribute to this board by using virtual sticky notes. So Ellen, who's sharing screen right now? I don't remember. Sean. So as I'm talking, Sean, will you kind of use your cursor to kind of highlight the places so it'll draw people's attention? So I'll start with the sticky notes on the middle of the page. So these sticky notes, if you click on them and with your mouse, you can drag them to different areas. If you then go onto the left side, so that's the ultimate place is you're grabbing and using sticky notes. Oh, we're not in a break anymore. You can select with the arrow where Sean is. You can add the T, adds text. So if you want to be writing text, you can use that. You can add more sticky notes, but you see there's already some there. You can add a comment. There's a lot of functions, but the most important one for you all is to just be able to grab a sticky note, add some language into it, and put it in. The other thing I'm going to say is that at the top right where it says hide other cursors, if you have a lot of people on a board, you see everyone's cursor moving at the same time, you'll probably want to click that. It'll make everybody else disappear and just see your own. Because when we share screen later, you'll see little cursors moving all over the place. So anyways, this, and then zoom in, zoom out at the bottom right is the other place that, the board can look small, but if depending on what kind of technology you're on, you can either be expanding, on a laptop, or you can use the click out and click in, and it'll zoom to make it bigger so you can see it. So I'm not going to go into a lot of more detail. I'm going to trust that folks will dive in, play with it as you can. If you're familiar, please utilize it. If you're not, then just add to the chat or save your comments, and we'll open it up for discussion. So without going any further into Miro, we're going to share the link. Was that already in there? Yep. So the link to the Miro board's in your chat. And we're going to work through a set of questions at a high level through each of the next 3 sessions of our conversation. So first, we're going to ask you to imagine what is possible, right? That frame of imagination that showed us that wonderful word cloud. Imagine what's possible. And we'll ask that as you think about these questions that you'll see in the board and that we'll bring up on slides, right? We're really saying around housing accountability or needs and production or capacity and urbanization, if we were to realize the legislative direction, what would that be like? And I specifically want you all to think through it, not just in the outcome broadly, but try to think about and pay special attention to naming the benefits for our vulnerable or marginalized or historically underinvested populations, right? Starting to bring in some of those equity values and principles. So as you think about reaching that legislative direction, what would that mean for folks that have been left out of our housing markets? What does that mean for folks that are at the fringes or at the edges of vulnerability? What would that mean for folks that currently can't access or are houseless, right? So thinking about legislative direction and what would that mean for our communities with a specific focus on equitable outcomes. And then we also want to give some voice and reference and or deference to what we heard pretty clearly in the last. What are the tensions, policy tensions or challenges that would arise, right? So we're going to always be trying to push ourselves to both remain in that visionary space, right? That you just all heard about, right? What are we really trying to achieve with more housing choice and types of housing that meet the diverse spectrum of needs across our communities, while always continuing to challenge us to think about the complexities of the complexities and the challenges and how that might play out. And again, really thinking about, what are some of the potential consequences or negative impacts or challenges that we need to name. So as we go through this conversation, I'm going to ask you to hold both of those things. The last thing I'll say is when we open this back up, we're going to have our presentation. Please feel free to utilize the board as much as you would like or add thoughts in the chat. When we come back, I'm going to ask for those who work directly with impacted communities, and I'll let you all decide kind of what that means. But folks that are working with frontline folks, folks that are working with communities that are impacted by housing, I'm going to ask you all to start the imagination conversation, and then we'll add and reflect. And I'm going to ask those that are in the housing development or more of the housing policy space, I'm going to ask you all to really help us name and lead the conversation around some of the challenges and barriers, because I heard loud and clear some of those last time. So again, trying to build some models of engagement around this group that are really trying to invite folks in from their area of expertise, from the areas and communities that you reflect and work and serve, and hopefully really having a robust conversation combining this tool as well as our reflection and vocal contribution. So I'm going to pause and just ask if there's any questions about our process that we're going to use. Fine. And we do have several folks, Ellen being one, who can help if you're navigating technology, but please, use whatever mechanism is going to work best for you. The mural board is a tool, but it's not the only way that we can hear your voice. We're going to open up and bring folks into the room as we go through the conversation. So with that, I'm going to pass it, I think, Thea and Sean, to the both of you to lead us through the first piece on accountability.
Thank you, Ben. And hi, everybody. I'm Thea Croman. I'm a housing policy analyst with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and really happy to be jumping into this work with you all. Staying with the theme of the day, I am going to introduce some high-level concepts here and start to talk about the questions and the work areas that this body will be sort of helping us navigate in terms of housing accountability. The Housing Accountability Statute, RS 197.293 and House Bill 2001, establish a framework that DLCD will use to track local government progress toward housing production targets and outcomes, to provide partnership and support with local governments, and to align effective enforcement measures when necessary. So the bullets that you see here are really the buckets into which we see this work fitting. And each of these really represents significant sub-questions and technical work. And again, for the purpose of this presentation, keeping it really high level, the statute tasks us with developing this accountability framework that creates a scaffolding for cities to use to build up and support their housing progress. And that's what we're going to be working on. Okay, so next slide, Sean. So this graphic represents the flow. Starting here at the top with sort of some data collection and reporting that we do along with cities, that DLCD is going to do along with OHCS, DAS, and the cities. And this really establishes the baseline point from which we can track progress. Moving down to the mid-cycle point of the evaluation, DLCD will take a step back and assess whether a city should be referred into what we're calling the Housing Acceleration Program, which is really an opportunity for the state to partner with the city to do sort of a deep dive on any barriers to housing production and to bring targeted resources to help resolve those. And this group here, the RAC and also the TAC, will be helping us decide sort of what that referral recommendation is based on. It's really important to note here that the acceleration program is not punitive. It's just an opportunity. It frames out an opportunity to dig into the barriers. However, if a city consistently misses deadlines or pushes past a really good faith limitation, it can end up in enforcement territory. And another part of the work that this group will be doing is to identify possible enforcement measures. And these are, they need to be designed to be significant enough to sort of have enough teeth to really incentivize good faith efforts. And what those look like, there's some latitude there. So that will be a robust conversation that we're going to be having. The hope is that they never have to be used, that they just provide a backstop to ensure that cities don't fall behind. At this point, I am going to hand it off to Sean to dig into some of the specifics of the statute, and then we can all sort of talk about the central questions together, go back to those 3 bucket areas and have a broader conversation about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Thea. And so what Thea described, these kind of questions that we need to address, right? So the statute has this kind of overall process, right, of kind of how the accountability system works. And it's intended to be pretty productive, like a partnership between state and local governments. And there's a lot that's specified in that statute. We provide an explanation of the basics of like how it works in the summary that we provided as part of the packet. But it pretty much starts with a, quantifiable assessment. So like we have these targets, right? We have these outcomes that we're tracking and evaluating. And there's this kind of determination that needs to happen. Like if we're not meeting our goals, we have to do a deeper qualitative evaluation and audit that's led by DLCD, right? And then once we do that audit, we make recommendations and we have to take actions to address the barriers that we identify in that audit, right? And then that's where we kind of get into, if we, don't take action by a prescribed deadline, that's when you end up into kind of these enforcement tools. So within this entire framework, there's kind of 3 major questions that we have to answer to operationalize this statute. There could be other things that we look at as part of the housing accountability work, but these are definitely 3 that we're like, oh, we have to do this if we want the statute to function the way it was intended. The first one is on who you refer into this audit process. So we have these, quantifiable, housing production targets. We're going to be tracking how much housing we're building, what the outcomes are, including equitable outcomes, that type of thing. We have to determine which subset of jurisdictions are referred as directed by the statute into this housing acceleration program. Once they're in that process, we also have to figure out, what does this audit process look like, right? Who do we talk to? Where do we engage with community members? Where do we engage with the city to make sure that this process is structured in a productive way, right? In a productive and thoughtful way. And then finally, right, we have the recommendations, we have the requirements to act that come out of that audit. If we miss or don't implement actions by a deadline, the bill also kind of requires us to develop these enforcement tools and incentives to ensure that we're taking actions in response to need. So what do those look like, and how do we ensure that that's structured in a way that's effective and makes every community a pro-housing community, right? So that's really the intent behind this overall statute. So with that, I think we're going to pass it back to discussion. Again, this is a very high level conversation. We're not going into all the specifics of the Housing Accountability Program. There's a lot in the statute that we wanted to leave as much time for kind of RAC member discussion as possible about the, the intended outcomes and the tensions and challenges towards achieving those outcomes. But yeah, let's pause for questions. Mercedes.
Thank you, Sean. So Mercedes, why don't you jump in, and then as folks, I realize I don't know what's going to work best for folks listening to the presentation, being on the Bureau board. So as Mercedes is going to open up with the first comment, I encourage folks to continue adding to the board, and then I'll ask you to kind of reflect. And Ellen can bring it up so you can see what people are adding. But Mercedes, jump in, please.
Thank you. So my question was just kind of like, I was trying to kind of follow along with when these different kind of pieces trigger in. And so with the incentives kind of being in that last bucket on that visual, does that mean that incentives are kind of introduced at a point in time when performance isn't happening? Or are there incentives for like everybody to perform? And then if we're getting more into detail because it's not quite landing, there are new incentives that would be paired with new accountability measures or like goals. I'm just kind of trying to figure out, where does that incentive piece kind of start?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the statute is pretty clear that the state's role in housing accountability is to provide resources for local governments to do the work, to, address barriers that can happen on the state side, right? All those types of things that's reflected in the program. That happens throughout the piece, right? When we're evaluating barriers to production, DLCD, part of their direction is to look at the state barriers, right? What are the potential maybe funding gaps, capacity gaps, right, that might be inhibiting production at the local level? That should be a part of that consideration. And then once we're talking about, say, the enforcement tools, the way that the accountability system is structured is, if you're, let's say, we're not meeting our goals, right? We're falling behind. It's not intended to be immediately punitive, right? It's not like XYZ thing is going to happen because you're not meeting a XYZ target. It's saying, oh, if we're not meeting our goals, we should do something about it. So here's some parameters. Here's a deadline to do those things, right, after an audit. And if you don't do those things by the deadline, that's when the enforcement tools kick in, right? So it's the requirement to take action by a deadline. That is the underpinning of the enforcement provisions that are part of the accountability program. Does that help clarify?
I think so, yeah. So even though they're kind of bundled there in the kind of visual at the bottom, that the incentives are actually all throughout. Yes. It's not like a new set of incentives are introduced when a new set of, I don't want to say like punitive, but like, or like other type of scaffolding. It's not just something that's introduced if performance is identifying additional difficulties. The incentives are throughout.
Yes, definitely true. I think it's intended to be right, partnership first, right? Let's start there.
Good, thank you, Mercedes. Ariel?
Thanks. And just building off that, and maybe this isn't helpful, but part of the conversation when we were forming the legislation is recognizing that there's a difference between a city doing everything they're supposed to do and trying versus performance. And so performance means can mean, like housing's not happening and it's not the fault of the city. There are other factors, and that's where all the technical assistance and incentives will be really helpful. And there's a difference between a city not like complying with the requirements versus not performing the needed production. So I just want to make sure that's clear as well. So that might help with thinking about like what kind of incentives we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up, Ariel. I think that what we're going to be looking for and trying to develop in the rule is how to acknowledge good faith efforts, even if it's not immediately reflected in like a quantitative outcome, and to just continue that partnership with cities as we sort of move through this process, not to punish people for punish jurisdictions for things that are not within their control.
Thanks. Yeah. And I would just add, I think we also had a recognition in the legislative group that particularly like early on in this program, it's going to be very difficult for any city to produce at their targets because we are so far behind as a state. And even if a community is doing like everything they possibly can, it's going to take some time to catch up and actually meet targets.
Thanks, Sarah. Mary Kyle?
Thanks. I had first one question. I'm finding it hard to follow the conversation as well as pay attention to this Miro board. So Sean, or anybody, did you say we will have time afterwards to add our comments to this? Because I'm kind of giving up on the Post-its because I'd like to hear what people
So
have to say.
We're going to start with questions. And then I think when we go into the next one, I'm going to do some real-time iteration. What I'm going to say is, unless you can really pay attention to multiple things at the same time, I'm going to say, listen to the presentation. I'm going to give us a few minutes to add things that come up for you into the Miro board, and then we'll open it up for conversation. So I think we need to create some separation.
Okay.
Mary Kyle. Yeah.
Okay, because I just gave up on the Miro board on this one, but I hope we have time after this meeting to add, because like I'm not doing anything on this one right now.
We can do that.
But then the question I had is sort of in line with Ariel's, that it seems, or in that same vein, it seems like from the memo and the description that the options are for some cities to go into a housing accountability or the housing acceleration program if they're not, if things are not working and they're not producing, however we define that. But is there something before that, because that housing acceleration program is what, 6 months of an audit and then some other things. It's a lengthy process. But it seems to me there should be something simpler to do early on. Like if a city is simply not met the deadlines that it committed to for taking certain actions, or things like that are really simple. Not that you have to figure out what that is now, but I think we need to have something that's quick and straightforward before this more lengthy housing acceleration program.
Thanks, Marco. So are you, there might be a question like, is there something before? And then if there's not, then I think you're making a suggestion there should be something.
It's not described in the memo that we got something before then, but I think we talked about that concept when we were all working on the legislation.
Sean, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and it is in the statute, right? That idea of, hey, if you're, just not doing things, right? There's this kind of pathway to, maybe the response is like, oh, you just need to implement the strategy you said you're going to do by this time, right? So do it, So that is definitely also a consideration. But, for the sake of time, we didn't go into all of the possible permutations and iterations of like what's articulated in the statute.
Well, and there may be enforcement that comes at that early time too, that doesn't require going into a housing acceleration program. It may be, okay, you've got 3 months to do this thing that you're going to do now, or else something, right? So the accountability could come sooner than going through a whole housing acceleration program process.
I think it's one of the questions to ask.
Certainly, I think that's, again, when we're thinking about the RAC's role of providing high level policy direction, that maybe, it certainly, I think, will be one of the conversations we have. Mercedes, I saw your hand popped up. Did you want to?
Yeah, because both what Mary Kyle is saying and what Ariel said makes me wonder about like kind of structures for ongoing review within those plans. Because like, let's say like a local government says, well, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to do this ballot measure so we have some extra funds for development. And that's kind of like the tool they're counting on, and voters don't approve it. And like that shouldn't necessarily put them into like corrective action immediately, but they should have a way of kind of identifying for the state, hey, the thing that we thought we were going to do, we can't do it that way. So we kind of actually need to go back and redo that portion of our plan with a new idea, which might make us delayed, but it's not because we're not doing it. It's because of those externalities. And so just wondering how that is factored in, like the kind of ongoing iteration of some of these plans.
So Sean, do you want to just, I mean, so I don't want to get too far down the path of what we're going to talk about as a rulemaking body, but if there's if there's a now, I mean, what you're naming is some of the challenges and tensions that we're going to have to grapple with as we think about what this model of accountability to move towards by pro-housing. I think that's the language you use, Sean, and really kind of achieve outcomes. But Sean, I'll give you a moment, and then I'm going to try to shift us back to the conversation I'm hoping to have today while still
Please.
naming some of these things. Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, no, and just to note too that that's a tension in the existing housing production strategy was one of the questions, right? What if a city put all their eggs in a basket on, say, a ballot initiative that fails, right? That type of thing. What then? And we've dealt with that before. It's absolutely a question we're going to have to grapple with. The way that the rule, in the previous process shook out, we kind of took an approach of what was the need being addressed, right? So like, did you really put all of your eggs in that one basket, or did you consider, right, maybe that won't pan out, so we took these other measures, and collectively we're still addressing the need, we're doing what we can, right? And so we will have ability and opportunity to grapple with these types of questions as we get into this particular issue.
Good, thank you, Sean. Alan, jump in.
Ben mentioned that you were gonna have underserved communities talk about the issues that we're facing.
Ben?
Yeah.
Ben, you mentioned that you were going to have underserved communities talk about some of the issues that we're facing. I don't want to jump ahead. I'm wondering if we're still going to do that.
Alan, you're right in the perfect place that I was going to go. So let's pivot. Let's pivot. Speak to it, please.
Getting accessible into hospital to have the money to it,
I know that the disability community did a significant amount of work in getting our concerns into, I'm sorry, accessibility into, which wasn't House Bill?
Yeah.
House Bill 2001 and 2889. So I wanted to talk for a moment about the housing landscape for people with disabilities.
And the
Specifically, I want to mention the lack of compliance.
Right.
Of the what?
Yeah.
Specifically Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act.
Which requires the creation of accessible units.
Which
requires
a specific number of accessible units
to be created.
to be created in federally funded housing.
The Council Disability has said that there's less than non-compliant.
What?
Right.
The National Council on Disabilities says there's widespread non-compliance.
And how is there rulemaking around federal?
And has
HUD.
and HUD is looking at rulemaking for Section 504.
So we have to use doubt and acknowledge as a housing stock.
So there's this huge gap between the knowledge of housing stock.
Yeah, and both acknowledge and our housing stock.
And
Both are not. Both
and both our knowledge
in the housing
and in the housing stock. I'm sorry.
So I'm when you have you I have a question about how we get over this at the state level.
So what I'm kind of winding up to is how do we get over this at the state level?
How do we know where accessible housing is?
So how do we know where the accessible housing is?
And how do we enforce the creation of new accessible units?
And how do we enforce the creation of new accessible units?
That voluntary compliance
I'm not sure if it's voluntary compliance
or state mandated compliance
or state mandated compliance
with 504.
with section 504.
I think we need something around that.
But I think we need something around that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I think there's probably a number of things in what you just described that will show up in multiple boxes, not just the accountability piece, and certainly 504 for federal housing, but what is that relationship to the state, but also ensuring when we think about, the legislative direction around housing needs and production, how are we accurately assessing the availability and needed units? So I'm sure there's a lot there that connects. And then I don't know, if there's an underlying question I think as well is just like, what does it mean at the state level? And is there a relationship to accountability and enforcement around the creation of accessible units for a population? So I don't know if there's a response to that or whether we just hold that as a need. But Sean, jump in.
Yeah, no, I do want to mention that the policy, it does pretty explicitly. I think there's a recognition among legislators, among advocacy groups, and just people generally that there's a huge deficit of information about where we have accessible housing, and that we ought to make it a priority and a goal that we start tracking and evaluating, like, are we producing these units, right? And what are the policies that we're putting into place that promote accessibility and foster the development of accessible housing? Those are absolutely part of that statutory provision. There is requirements now that we, as part of the housing production dashboard, start measuring and start, accounting for the percentage of our stock that has some types of accessibility features, right? That'll be part of OHCS and DLCD's development of the housing production dashboard that we mentioned previously as part of their kind of obligations under the statute. And then one of the things that we can kind of evaluate in this rulemaking is, right, how do we encourage and promote the development of accessible housing within our cities too, recognizing there's a huge need. I think that definitely fits within the context of the statutory direction.
Yeah.
I should mention, there is that nexus with federal statute there. That definitely, like, what they said on federal statute was not like part of our explicit direction. Doesn't mean we can't like consider its intersection with our work, but just to be clear that wasn't directly part of what the legislature told us to do.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Alan. So, Richard, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to ask for, as I said earlier, for folks that are kind of working directly with communities, I want to introduce you all to speak to kind of legislative direction, what you might have added to the board or what's coming up for you. And then I want to open it up around some of the unique challenges. But where'd your hand go? Where'd you go? Or Brian, right? No, it wasn't. We had called on Brian. Who was it?
I think it was Rich Rogers, right? Or
Yeah,
Richard Rogers?
Richard. There you are. Sorry, you disappeared on my screen real quick, so thank you for coming back in.
I don't want to go into a deep dive, so stop me if you at any point, but there's currently statutory requirements now for compliance with the Fair Housing Act, which provides adaptable units. When you have 4 more units, ground floor units, it gets really involved, and I don't want to go that deep. But there are provisions in place now that require compliance with the Fair Housing Act with basically apartments. When you get 4 more units, now anybody can go above that statutory requirement. If you want to make all your units adaptable, that's fine. There is a difference between accessibility and adaptability. I don't know if we want to take that dive or not.
Not yet.
but there's certainly compliance right now with providing adaptable units. Now, if someone is using federal money, they want to require all units to be adaptable regardless of that other scope. That's certainly a possibility as well, but I'll probably just stop right there if that helps.
No, I appreciate that. Richard.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rich. And I'll just add, let's not do a deep dive into that, just recognizing time.
Thank you, Sean.
Um,
Yeah, this group's ready to dive into not even into the weeds, like into the subsoil. But I want to bring us back up. And so I had seen, Beth, you had a hand up. I was just gonna ask, like, to move towards the closing of this part of our conversation. Really just want to give some life to like the imagination piece and just naming some of the challenges. And to Mary Kyle's comment earlier, we'll keep adding to the board. We can send this link out so folks can keep populating it. This is going to inform our conversations, across the life of this work. And I know we're at meeting 1B, so let's not try to solve every complexity today. Beth, I thought I saw your hand up. Yeah, Beth, please.
Yeah, hi. So I'm the director of the Curry County Homeless Coalition, serving Curry County. And, I've been involved in our housing assessment, housing needs assessment, housing studies since 2018 and moving forward in our community. What I see is there's a diverse demand and we should have a diverse inventory to meet that demand. It's just, I know it may seem difficult, and it does in a lot of cases. I put a question in the chat. We have infrastructure issues in Curry County and in the city of Port Orford. They can't expand housing. I walked into Langlois Market last week and there's a boil water notice on the door. Our infrastructure what's the incentive to improve the infrastructure so we can build? Was the question that I put in the chat. But amongst our homeless population, there is diversity. There is the one-time situational, rapidly housing, they're back in, housing or some sort of shelter immediately. And then there's the chronic homeless, and then there's everybody in between. And so the diversity of our housing inventory needs to meet the demand of our populations that we're serving.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I mean, I appreciate you did a little both and there. You talked about both the vision of diverse, the diversity of the demand and diversity of the inventory and some of the challenges that are there. Alan, I see your hand. I'm going to come back to you in a second. I wanted to open it up. If there's anyone who hasn't contributed to some of the imagination first, I'm going to ask you to do so. Yep, Anna.
Yeah, I guess like some of that visioning piece, looking over at like some of our listening tour findings from our alliance of like how do we of wanting housing that's in areas that are safe, that are stable, and by stable we mean like firmly rooted in the ground and would withstand earthquakes, ability to live there long term, that are in walking distance of like their work, the grocery stores, and entertainment, like envisioning homes where people can build community and have strong relationships with their neighbors, because sometimes like highways get in the way of like you being able to like go and meet your neighbors and have like a meal with them. And so and then like and having homes that are accessible and that people can pay to like have a home at the diversity of like their income levels, and that they're not recreated in the same, that homes aren't created in the same areas where we've seen pollution, where we've seen air pollution, where we've seen industry surround certain neighborhoods. Because then I'd like seeing homes that are built less in those areas, because then again that also impacts people's health, and so like in the long term, if homes aren't being created in these areas again, then hopefully that can help people's health in the long term. And then also homes that are sustainable and safe, because right now our current housing stock, especially for low-income communities, it has mold and isn't insulated very well. And so how are these homes safe for our communities? So those are some of the things that I'm envisioning.
Yeah, thank you, Ann. And I imagine that some of that vision will show up in some of these other pieces, but exactly what it's hoping to not lose sight of as we have our conversations and get into the weeds of policy, that we don't lose some of the imagination and what we would hope to be possible. Any other kind of imagination? And I'm going to go to Alan, but anybody else that wants to stay at that level? Okay, Shane, jump in.
Can everyone hear me fine?
Yep.
Thank you. It's kind of a mixture of utilizing the land that we already have within an urban growth boundary, mixed with kind of summoning a certain kind of nostalgia again for building types in previous decades, and mixed with like diversified home ownership. And so I just imagine Portland, for example, has a lot of places in the inner east side where if there was a certain kind of zoning capacity where like duplexes or tenplexes were more available, those kind of missing middle housing types mixed with, say, there's a portion of land that's able to be in a community land trust with a particular housing nonprofit, either for people exiting houselessness or say queer communities where it's like a queer-owned community land trust. And then you end up having a combination of like shared garden space. There's one or two mutual commercial units on the bottom floor and also accessible units in the back. And then you just have balconies on the top where during the spring and summer, people enjoy their time and they're cooperatively owning with that community land trust or in a housing cooperative, sharing not just the costs of the taxes or anything that would be involved, but with the increased equity and things that they could leverage, which of course, as you provide that stability and then create more diversified home ownership opportunities, say for a studio condo unit, or there's a 2-bedroom, you end up opening it up to different kinds of family structures, very commonly in the queer community, but also other people who may be a single parent and they just have 2 or 3 children that they're working within a certain means, but they want to have that increased leveraged equity and they want to do it in a garden, beautiful space that's already within, you know, civic structure that is available in terms of inner cities and things like that.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. I'm like visualizing in your description. So thank you for articulating it in the way you did and really naming. I'm like literally I'm on the deck right now, looking over a garden. Alan, I'm going to come to you and then I'm going to ask if there's anyone who wants to name challenges around accountability, and then we'll move on to, I already see a lot of stuff on the board. So Alan, please jump in.
Yeah, I think I'm going to think that policies are in the weeds when they affect underserved communities.
Yeah, I think there's a real issue when saying policies are in the weeds when they're about serving underserved communities.
A lot of the hard work that underserved community.
Because a lot of powerful groups don't understand underserved communities.
Why
So I just want to reiterate that there is widespread discrimination against people with disabilities in housing.
Don't know how many accessible we have.
And the fact
that
that is why we don't know how many accessible units exist.
is
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So I'm going to just appreciate the call in. I'll describe it as, and I'll be cautious with my language. So it's a true gift of being able to give voice to things that maybe are not always aware. And I just appreciate your willingness and candor. So thank you. So before we move to the housing needs and production part of the conversation, I just wanted to open it up folks wanted to name some of the challenges. Again, trying to really structure a conversation where we're both being imagining the possible world that we can live in, and then just not being naive to some of the things that might get in the way that we need to name now, even though they're going to cut across a lot of our conversations. Let me see if I can see the order. I think it was Anne, then Jessica, then Holly.
Hi, thank you. I hate to be one who's only looking at challenges. I'd rather be like more optimistic about what we can
Well, you
achieve.
can name it imagination too. I won't limit you only to that, Anne. Sorry.
Okay. But I've been kind of tangling over, we have this desire to get this balance of ownership versus rental housing as part of the production strategy, and then maybe there's an enforcement element of that. But we don't really regulate ownership versus rental nature of housing. And, certainly apartments are something we typically think of as rentals, but that's kind of a regional thing. And any of the ownership models, those units can also be rented. So I feel like there's a challenge in figuring out how to both plan for rental versus ownership and also track it. And it'll probably be fluid over time, some of the things that are purchased and then rented out. So that's just an issue I wanted to raise.
No, thanks for naming that. Let's go, Jessica, Holly, Beth.
Hi, yes, thank you. One of the things that I kind of thought of first thing as a challenge for this piece is that as a developer of affordable housing, we recognize that some neighborhoods don't want us in their neighborhoods. And so, with this accountability saying, the expectation is certain number of units, certain areas, certain cities, we may run into the challenges of certain neighborhoods not wanting us there. And so what does that look like in overcoming those barriers, I think, is something that we could think about in this group, I think.
Yeah, no, thanks for naming that. Let's go, Holly, Beth, Shannon, and then Brock.
I really appreciate what Ellen was saying, and I was thinking about how a better understanding of where some of the underserved communities that are represented on this group, where they see the challenges versus where our structure is currently might help inform our rulemaking process a lot better to see that rub between our current structure and current regulation. I realize that we've got a pretty jam-packed schedule, but is there a way to create maybe a sub-meeting or use office hours or something like that to take a deeper dive into some of the issues that Alan and I'm sure others on this rack would like to raise?
I love the suggestion, and so we can explore that as a follow-up. Certainly, it's also to the extent that folks are comfortable and willing to name some of these things on the mural board, that's going to be one of the ways we capture these things. So we'll work behind the scenes to figure out how do we bring all of that back into the room as we have these conversations going forward. So thanks for that recommendation. Beth, Shannon, Brock, Garrett.
Thank you. Challenges. We're now facing the challenge of, investors swooping into our communities and buying up the last bastion of what is really truly affordable housing in our communities, mobile home parks, single home family homes. So that's a challenge, particularly here on the South Coast, as we are a tourist-driven economy. And that brings me to my next challenge, which is there seems to be a desire on the South Coast to be the rich people's playground, but there doesn't seem to be consideration for the backbone of that economy, which is our service industry workers. They can't afford to live here. I have a restaurant next door to my housing navigation center, and when the developer bought the building that we're in to create affordable housing, low-income subsidized units in our community, there were two existing tenants, commercial tenants in the building, and we went next door to the restaurant and said, we want you to oppose this project. And the restaurant owner said, I don't know why I would do that, because I'm buying gym passes for half my staff so they have a place to shower so they can be clean when they show up for work. So, you know, that's another challenge, is opposition to those people, the socioeconomic discrimination, the disability, I mean, the discrimination across the board, serving people with severe and persistent mental illness, substance use disorder, those are disabilities. And those people are discriminated against because there's not housing inventory stock for them in our community. There is not any supportive housing. What units are coming online are projected. And so, you know, it's just, that's where we're starting out here in the South Coast, is in the negative. We're in the deficit. Everybody's in the deficit. It's in this conversation. But I think, and then there's absolute opposition to the notion that we focus on what I call the bottom two rungs of the housing ladder. We're asking people to go from chronic homelessness to stable housing, and that's not realistic. We've got to have those in between, the bottom two rungs on our housing ladder, just to help people get stabilized and become good tenants and maybe homeowners someday. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth. Shannon, then Brock and Garrett, and then I'm going to move us on.
Gonna try to be quick. I know that there's a lot of love, and Ariel, good job, right, with infrastructure. Like, I want to say, like, big I infrastructure for cities. I want to say, as developers, we need little I infrastructure too. So getting a road cut through, right, to land we already possess, or getting sewer stubbed in an infill lot, like, that can be an obstacle for nonprofit developers. I also just think local leadership and expertise, right? How do we wrap around and sustain people doing good work and make sure we retain local leadership and expertise around the state? What about that capacity? Because it is a capacity thing. I do just have to set the record straight that home ownership definitely can be regulated. Definitely can be regulated. And I know could talk more offline about various strategies, but we can for certain get there. It is a real thing. And just, I don't think I've heard it mentioned in this space, but I think vacation rentals, right? Maybe we want to, like, just name those, because they are housing units that exist, but they mostly aren't serving the local communities. And I think those should be named. Thanks.
Yep, thanks, Sean. I know that's come up either on the board, someone might have said it, second home and vacations. Let's go Garrett, then Brock, and then we're going to move to the next part of our agenda.
Sure. I just wanted to offer an observation that as we start visioning what we want Oregon's housing picture to look like, we shouldn't lose sight of who we believe is going to build that housing. So as we run around talking about all the ideals, which I think is a very important exercise, obviously, and thinking about what does this look like on the ground, I think there's going to be a temptation to figure out how we turn those into certain types of mandates, or at least policies that encourage that type of thing. And in so doing, I would just encourage this entire group to make sure that when we're engaging in those discussions down the line, that we remember that we have to get somebody to build that housing. And that is an important question when you're talking about planning, when you're talking about adding to the set of regulatory mechanisms, barriers, or allowances. And that really is just what I would encourage everybody to think about, because from my perspective, what I see every day is we've done a lot of good in trying to reduce barriers to different types of housing. I would cite the middle housing bill as foremost among those. I think one of the problems that we have is we have a lot of desires about meeting various policy goals that may or may not be in tension with each other. And I think one of the ways that we could do that is think about how we want to foster actual construction of those homes.
All right, thank you, Garrett. Brock?
Yeah, again, just touch on the homeownership piece. I think that's going to be really critical, not only, from the standpoint of it's good for the state and wealth generation, but also from, an equity standpoint, making sure that, every person, every type of person, regardless of their income or any other, characteristic, is able to achieve homeownership. And I think a big part of that and a big challenge that we're going to face is prioritizing which housing we produce when. If we just produce, homeownership products that are affordable for, let's just say 100% AMI, but there's not additional homeownership products that are available for people that are making more than that, they're not just going to sit back and wait for something bigger to be developed. They're going to buy that unit that, based on the price range, should be, for someone in the workforce, but they're going to get out. But the people in the workforce are going to get out competed. So I think we need to make sure we're focusing on, yes, we need to build everything, and yes, we definitely need to build more affordable housing and more workforce housing. But if we neglect any part of the price spectrum, we're going to see cascading effects, with people coming down and buying less expensive homes because it is an ownership opportunity that they want. But then that would preclude somebody else that would normally be in that income bracket from purchasing that home.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Rob. Shannon, is that your old hand? All right, let's move on. I think Marty and Celestina, is that who I'm passing it to?
Yes. Good afternoon, RAC members. What a wonderful discussion. I want to offer appreciation to you all for holding space with our team, directly from me and the project team. It's really great to have all this expertise in the room. Again, my name is Mari Valencia Aguilar. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a housing planner with the department. I will be co-presenting with my colleague Celestina Teva, who been also named on this particular topic area, the needs in production. Before we dive a little bit deeper, I guess an important note that I want to offer up front is that the timeline around the specific work, per House Bill 2001, it outlines a date of January 1st of 2025. So just keep that in mind. But with that, if we can move on to the next slide. So like the housing accountability topic area, the needs in production topic area, or the NAPTAC, which is the acronym that we're using, is also includes 3 major policy issues that rise to the top. As Sean mentioned, there could be more that are part of this particular topic area, but these 3 are kind of the ones that came up for us as we started to kind of do some thinking around all the things that we've been tasked to do under the bill. So the first topic area, which is noted in your NAPTAC summary in the packet of materials, is this charge to define what needed housing. Earlier, you heard from my colleagues Sean and Ethan describe how, the ONA methodology, Oregon Housing Needs Analysis methodology, was adopted as part of House Bill 2001, and this is a major policy shift that reorients the way that cities will be planning for housing under Goal 10. So again, just to reiterate that allocation comes from the state to the cities. And it's segmented by affordability. So all communities have the shared responsibility of the overall need, which is kind of a departure from the old system, right? That wasn't the case under the old Goal 10. So this collective approach of, the share of the housing need does aim at, ensuring that various dimensions of housing needs, especially for those who have been historically marginalized or excluded, such as people experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities, communities of color, etc., are not overlooked. The ONA methodology does also address a shortcoming with the previous system in that the way under the HCA in the old system, the local governments projected and entrenched past development into the future, which tended to have tended for cities to plan for housing that didn't necessarily align with current and future community member needs and their financial capabilities. But the ONA, again, seeks to address that. So with this major fundamental change, the big policy question that we have to tackle here is what rules would best support cities in appropriately translating that allocation of their need into a complete holistic picture of the community's needed housing. So in other words, how can we develop rules that best support cities in making, local policy determinations that will help achieve equitable access for housing that is affordable to all members of their communities, regardless of some of the things that we've heard, right? Race, gender, orientation, ability, age, and other protected class statuses. Also, it includes thinking about where the housing is located and whether it meets the needs of various family dynamics, sizes, things of that nature, or accessibility needs. We heard in that previous discussion a lot of, challenges that people experiencing with disabilities face. And so that's also a consideration here. And then also in terms of housing that is in close proximity to opportunity and community assets like quality schools or equitable employment opportunities, reliable transportation, grocery stores, place of cultural centers, etc. So that is kind of the big question here to tackle as in the needs and production. So moving on to the next kind of big topic area or issue, policy question to address is the integration of affirmatively furthering fair housing into our statewide planning goal 10 obligation and planning process. So the bill made a significant change to the housing production strategy statute, and we heard this earlier too from my colleague Sean, and that's specifically an ORS 197290, which now requires that cities, as part of their housing production strategy work, they affirmatively further fair housing. We've used this term, but what does it mean? The definition is noted here in front of on this slide, but really what it is a federal policy initiative aimed at promoting fair housing practices and addressing housing discrimination in the U.S. This was kind of it's rooted in the Fair Housing Act. It was passed in 1968 as part of the Civil Rights Act. And the goal really is to go beyond, when we think about AFFH, it's a mandate to go beyond just simply prohibiting discrimination. It's really a call for meaningful actions to address significant disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity, and also eliminate barriers to housing choice. This practice typically lives on the currently in the this mandate and the work associated with the AFFH under federal guidance. Typically lives in agencies that receive a direct allocation from the U.S. Department of Urban Development, HUD. I usually just say HUD and I forget the Urban and Housing and Development. I think that's what it is. Apologies there. But really, so these entities who receive that direct allocation or a portion of an allocation from a main entity like a county, they have a federal obligation to kind of act on what I just described is the call to action under AFFH. Some entities use the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice process, the assessment of fair housing, or possibly what what the feds are currently contemplating, which is the equity analysis. But you thinking about that structure, how can we bring that work in and integrate it into the statewide planning goal 10 work under the housing production strategy program? And so the last note on this is I want to give Commissioner Lazo, who I think is no longer on the call with us, but if any of you all were at the Housing Land Advocates conference earlier this year, he talked about how his excitement for this integration of AFFH into Goal 10. It's something that a lot of housing advocates have been really kind of promoting and so I want to give him the credit for the two images on this slide. He discussed this integration as a beautiful love story, and so keeping that in mind, that is really what we get to do as part of the work under this policy issue, is how do we, set up the housing production strategy program to integrate some of these really important concepts, this important concept of AFFH, or affirmatively furthering fair housing, into goal 10 planning. And I will note, a lot of cities already are doing really good housing work, either because they're doing things that advance AFFH under federal kind of practice, or because they're choosing to be pro-housing, centering equity in their work to achieve equitable housing outcomes on the ground locally. So it's just building, kind of this framework that offers opportunity to local governments to really dig into a lot of the things that you all raised and discussed in that previous segment. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Celestina, who will kind of overview the last policy issue under this topic area.
Thank you so much, Mari. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, also a housing planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. This third portion of the needs and production focus for rulemaking process is perfectly slated after the AFFH portion, because while it has enough content to it that it should be considered its own focus area, it also is in many ways a way that we can affirmatively further fair housing in the needs and production rulings. We have a charge that emerged from an acknowledgement that support from the state to our local jurisdiction partners is needed in terms of implementing many of the various housing production strategies to get to accommodating the housing need that we have across the state. And so as part of that, in House Bill 2889, our state legislators allocated some funds for the state to be able to actually create and develop adoption-ready housing production strategies. So what we currently have are a slate of developed strategies for consideration and implementation by our local partners, but we don't have the strategy actually developed out to the point that they are what we're calling adoption ready. And so when we say adoption ready and we say these strategies, some of you might be wondering a little bit more about what that might encompass, and we have a few examples here on the slide. But it is somewhat broad. It can be actual code language. It could be building plans. It could be funding pathways like TIF districts, tax increment financing districts, and that's some of what has come up on the call today. It can also be targeted development programs. Like one item that we have here as an example is in Rogue Valley. They have a lifelong housing program that is targeted at age in place supports in our housing stock, but also we can think about similar things when we're framing out these rules to support accessible housing, for example. But that also loops back into potential building plans, making sure that the adoption ready strategies that we have are affirmatively furthering for housing and are also ideally, which is why we have such a diverse set of RAC members here and TAC members as well to support, ideally applicable across the state. So that will be some of the charge for this particular focus area. And then lastly, there's a note that kind of ties us back over to the urban growth boundary conversation that we had earlier on the call, which is just that these housing production strategies and particularly the adoption ready supports that we'll be developing here, along with middle housing model code, along with our climate friendly and equitable communities work, all together represent some examples of efficiency measures that local jurisdictions can be taking in advance of coming to the point of pursuing an urban growth boundary amendment. So that's just a little bit of a teaser, as you all are seeing, of how a lot of this work is interrelated, and we have started to section it out into these focus areas, but we are also tasked with seeing all of those connections as we go along. And with that, I think that we are going to do a similar thing as we did with the last focus area, and I'll hand it over to Ben.
Great, thank you both. I am looking at the clock a little bit. I'm seeing a heck of a lot of stickies on the board. So why don't I just open it up, and I'm going to ask if folks have not contributed so far in this meeting. I'd love to create some space for anyone who hasn't talked. So there's a ton of stuff on the board. If there's something coming up for you, or if you're seeing something on the board that you want to lift up or give some life to, it'll be great. So why don't I ask if there's anyone who hasn't yet contributed, if you would start our conversation.
Something that's
Yeah,
coming to my mind in terms of policy is I'd be really curious on the adoption ready side to think about kind of the policies of financing, to really provide the folks who are financing and leveraging funding the tools that they need, so that the challenge isn't really that we can alleviate the barriers that exist as much on the funding side, so that we can be more thoughtful in where that money goes and how it's spent.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. Let's go, Mac. We haven't heard from you.
Hey there. Sorry, I was just trying to find the unmute button. One of the challenges that I kind of want to highlight, which I don't think can fully be addressed within the context of the rulemaking of ONA itself, but still is worthy of consideration, is how local jurisdiction staff capacity lays into this. And I mean that in the sense of, do they have enough people on their permitting and their permitting staff to do timely reviews of permitting? I work in affordable housing development, and a predictable permitting timeline is critical to closing on our finances, since when we have state money, we often have a set closing timeline and then are only able to move it out once for a maximum of 30 days. And so having that predictability is critical, but also making sure that local jurisdictions, as you know, we're calling, I think in this group, I hear a lot of calls for denser housing types, maybe larger housing types than some of these jurisdictions have seen previously. And like reviewing a planned unit, mostly single family home development, is one thing as a permitting staff, but reviewing a 5-story or a 4 or 5-story multifamily building is a different task entirely. And so how can we support those local jurisdictions as they get that influx of permitting, that they have enough staff to still review those permits on a predictable timeline, but also that they have that technical capacity to understand some of these larger housing types there. Is I want to make sure we make room for that. And then also in terms of like an adoption ready policy that is at no direct cost to jurisdictions, is making sure that, you know, these affordable housing projects that have public dollars, that have these constraints when it comes to when they need to close, that they get to go to the top of the permit review pile for returning comments and reviews to make sure that they can stay on time. So I just wanted to pepper that in. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Mac. Thanks for naming a few of those pieces. Rachel? And then Brian.
Thanks. I wanted to echo Max and say that I think capacity is an issue industry-wide, and that when we're looking at adding, you know, several thousand units in a short amount of time, it makes a lot of us who are on the development side, the finance side, you know, in the organizations that all work together to get these on you know, online, frankly, pretty scared. I also just wanted to raise the issue of middle housing. I think that we could all acknowledge that there's a huge need for the production of that missing middle housing. And there really, from what I have seen so far, is not a lot of, well, there's not production of it at this time, and it's hard to figure out how to finance it. And so I don't know if there's some motivating factors we could talk about in our group, but I think missing middle housing is just a huge piece that we should be considering going forward.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Rachel. Brian?
Just very quickly, my comments didn't fit neatly on the Miro board. Two hopes, dreams, goals of the process. Number one, that the rules that we're creating, they are providing private markets, private equity with tremendous incentives to build affordable, fair, fairly located, more affordable housing types. So that we're empowering the private market to do what the private market now is having difficulty delivering, and that we are all struggling with. And number two, that some of the rules that we create are actually slimmer than the body of the existing rules in place today, and that we're seeking simplification and more effectiveness at the same time, not additional layers upon layers, but a simplification that's more effective and serves the state. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thanks for naming it the way you did. Lindsay?
So something I've been thinking about is also just making sure that we have the infrastructure capacity for large scale production in these areas. Many of our water sources are already over appropriated, and the Corps is looking into possibly decommissioning hydropower at the Willamette Valley dams. So making sure that we are requiring or incentivizing water-wise appliances and energy efficient materials and items like that. We just need to think about the future of our like energy sources and our water sources as well.
Yeah, appreciate you naming that. And I certain, folks around the state understand the other complexities around water allocation and availability. Thanks, Lindsay. Brian, I assume that's your old hand up and you're not jumping back in. Other folks, let's just open it up. If I haven't heard from you, I want to encourage that, but otherwise, just any other thoughts or reflections? I'm going to keep us moving because there's a ton of stuff that you've already contributed, but if there's something that feels urgent that you want to name, please do. Brock, jump in.
I think this relates both to this one and the housing capacity and urbanization piece, but particularly as it relates to guidance documents for local government planners, and generally just for the public to be able to understand, what's being produced. I think it's really important that we create realistic thresholds in these guidance documents about, what different types of development look like. You see one source that, I've seen cited very frequently, that tells you that townhouses can be built between 11 and 25 net units per acre. I've seen other resources that even cite that resource that at the same time say townhouses are, built between 20 and 45 units per acre. That's a huge discrepancy. That's almost, 50% or, 100% increase if you're looking at it the other direction. So I think having, really, really understandable guidance documents about like, hey, this is, in theory, this is all possible, right? Here's what we see that actually gets produced, and that's what it looks like. And, obviously there's a range for that, right? But I think we need to be very clear, for the public and for local governments to say like, hey, if this is getting built, this is what you can reasonably expect. And yes, it is possible to go higher than that. And it's, great if we can be more efficient, but reasonably, here's what you can expect to see producing these different types.
Yeah, thanks, Brock. And Mercedes, sorry, your hand blended into the background and I couldn't see it. So thanks for being patient. Jump in.
Absolutely. Thank you. So a couple of things that came to mind for me as we were going through the conversation is also what is the ongoing kind of review and monitoring of this work? I think with fair housing, for example, I think sometimes we see really good moves to do affirmative fair housing to fill units, but then as they become vacant years later, that same effort isn't necessarily there. Or as properties degrade, tax credits expire, like that's how we're losing units while also building and not quite maintaining capacity. So I'm thinking about what are ways in which we're also supporting the long term of this, not just the launching of it. And then around kind of like resources and planning and predictability, I wonder if there is a way for the state to kind of to consider some more regional allocations. So instead of everybody kind of competing all at once for state tax credits or bonds or things like that, if there are ways to regionally allocate those so that like communities are competing with like communities. I think especially with all the infrastructure conversations we've been having, that's going to increase your price per unit, which if you're also trying to do a low density, because that's the community that you live in, your project is not going to compete as well for something that is very high density that doesn't need to do that extra work, and their price per unit is going to be much lower. And then that can also create some predictability for local governments to say, well, maybe not my city or my county, but like this region has X number of dollars allocated annually or during the biennium that we can essentially count on as we're also looking for, other investment or other funds that might need to be paired with that to make a complete project, other types of incentives that we can use for private development to move into that space as well, that could also potentially create a level of predictability if we were able to say regionally what you can kind of count on as the minimum, and then anything that your community does in addition to that is just going to make it easier for you to achieve those goals.
Yeah, thank you, Mercedes. Any other last thoughts on this? We're almost back on time. That's my way of limiting the last thoughts. Okay. And again, hopefully folks saw it in the chat. We are gonna, Ethan put in these same questions that we're chewing on right now will be in the post-meeting survey. We'll also leave the mural boards open. So you'll have some time to continue to contribute, and this will be a real good baseline and foundation for many of the conversations we're having. We're getting a preview of things that we'll be diving much deeper into as this work unfolds. So just as a reminder. So I'm gonna move us to, I think it's Karen, you're gonna kick us off, Maddie, Jenna. We're gonna move in. Do we have a break? Why don't we take a short break? Let's say like 3 minutes. Can we do like a 3 minute break, or is that just a jerk move? We'll do 5, and let's just take 5. I feel like humans need 5 minutes. It's 3:18. Let's come back at 3:23. Thanks, folks. We're gonna make our way back here. Final stretch. So again, camera on or a thumbs up and I'll know you're back. And then we'll do the last part of our agenda today. And thanks, I know folks have continued to add to the board. So I really appreciate folks' contributions. So let's see. We got Karen, Maddie, Jenna, you all ready to go? Okay, floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Ben. Thanks for hanging in there, folks. One last time, adding to Jen Chapman, also Karen is just fine. She, her UGB specialist with the department DLCD. I'm here today with an urbanization team. We were recently hired here at the housing division at the department over the summer and the fall. I think for the sake of time, I will let them introduce themselves. I realize we are probably the last thing standing in between you and getting out to see this last bit of daylight we have in these late, short days in our winter. So I will keep it brief. We have 3 different areas that we're going to cover under capacity and urbanization. Each one of us will delve into it a little bit deeper, and we'll get to a little bit more detail from what you heard early in the presentation this afternoon. So you'll see we've organized the work and information we're going to give you today around methodologies and assumption around capacity. You heard a little bit from Sean about how capacity is tackled and analyzed in the analysis and studies that cities do. You'll also hear it referred to as a buildable lands inventory or a BLI. Another area is around development readiness. A lot of you already mentioned that. A lot of the feedback we got is talking about public facilities, that infrastructure and concept planning for communities, and then creating greater clarity or certainty around urbanization and growth management. And that's what we refer to as your urban growth boundary amendments or those land swaps and exchanges and creating urban and rural reserves. So we'll get right into it. I think next up, I'll have Jenna introduce herself and we'll get into further detail on that buildable lands inventory.
Great, thanks, Cotton. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Hughes. I am the Housing and Growth Management Analyst with DLCD and one of the point people for the capacity and urbanization work. And one of the major policy areas we'll be exploring in this rulemaking is refining BLIs or buildable land inventories. And as Sean mentioned earlier, a BLI is one part of a housing capacity analysis. And the process involves identifying constraints to development and estimating how much capacity there is for more housing and how many units could realistically be built. This also includes making assumptions about housing types and where these units will come from. The picture on the slide to the right is an example from Medford of their last BLI. And the policy questions we'll be seeking to answer in this rulemaking are: 1, which methodological approaches for a buildable lands inventory should be incorporated into administrative rules and guidance documents to provide cities with certainty in adopting housing capacity analyses? And 2, how do we balance analytical complexity with accurately assessing the capacity of lands within the urban growth boundary in varying contexts? So as described in your packet, there's a housing and capacity and urbanization overview. Our goal will be to articulate the range of options for how to inventory land and constraints, as well as estimate the capacity for different size cities. And so we'll look not just at the number of housing units, but also the diverse range of housing options within the urban growth boundary. And I will pass it now to Maddie.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline Phillips. Friends and colleagues call me Maddie. I am the public facilities planner with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I believe that the conversation around this topic has already been started by many of the RAC members. Thanks for offering those comments related to the context of infrastructure as it relates to housing. As you all may be familiar, there are many challenges that the state and its cities face related to infrastructure, not limited to things like the terminology phantom capacity within cities due to inadequate sewer, water, or other costly public improvements, failing infrastructure that cannot serve efficient parcels as they are speculated for upzoning or other kinds of efficiency measures that have been mentioned as options for meeting capacity needs through our housing capacity or housing needs analyses. And further, thinking about growth and land within urban growth boundaries, UGBs, that has remained undeveloped for decades due to either inaccessibility or inadequate service access. So not dissimilar from how we've described the greater housing need and the context of our charge within it, we also will be looking at infrastructure as a very large spectrum of need. However, thinking very specifically within this group's purview around the context in which infrastructure might serve housing and housing efficiencies. So you'll see on this slide there are two questions or two topic areas that we'll be addressing through our discussions with the Rules Advisory and Technical Advisory Committees. The first is methods for cities to assess development readiness. And development, I can share the definition of that in a moment, of lands identified as vacant or partially vacant within a buildable land inventory. And further actions that integrate public facilities, water, sewer, streets, with the urbanization process to ensure that land is development ready upon annexation. Development readiness, as our legislators have described in House Bill 2001, are buildable lands that are likely to support the production of housing because the lands are annexed and zoned to allow housing through clear and objective standards and procedures, readily served by public facilities or identified in capital improvement plans, or not encumbered by protective regulations or have appropriate entitlements. So our discussions at our rules and technical advisory committees around the topic of infrastructure will focus on methods and actions that integrate public facilities and their planning efforts, which typically works or our partners in public works, into the discussion of production, affordability, and choice of housing options to encourage development readiness. So that might include addressing things like timeliness of buildable lands, both existing in cities and future in UGBs or future urban growth boundaries. And in doing so, we hope the conversation will identify synergy opportunities that cities can capitalize on and better define challenges such as funding approaches and process hurdles to ensuring that communities' production and implementation plans are successful. And from there, I'll pass it on to Karen to explain a little bit more about our growth boundary questions.
Great, thank you. I want to leave plenty of time for our Mayor Board comments and discussion, so I'll be pretty brief here. But part of the charge that we were given by the Land Conservation Development Commission was to create greater clarity and certainty for local governments embarking on these urbanization processes. And this included facilitating the adoption of urban and rural reserves in our non-metro cities. Effectively, what this does is it front loads a lot of the analytical work that a jurisdiction does in planning for growth before the actual land need has been identified to meet their housing projections. Additionally, we're tasked with providing additional flexibility for an urban growth boundary land exchange or swap. What this does is it allows a city to leverage that UGB land exchange process to remove lands that are really unlikely to develop for a variety of different reasons locally. In addition, we're tasked with developing a very comprehensive or an abundance of different guidance materials with greater depth, keeping our statutes and the rules pretty streamlined and going into greater detail with jurisdictions in their guidance materials on how you facilitate a successful urbanization process, and with the goal of minimizing that risk of appeal and litigation. I think somebody at the department at some time mentioned that there was a guidance document at some point. I think it was authored maybe in the 90s on a typewriter. So that's what exists today for your use. using that as a starting point, there's a lot of opportunity for us to work in that area. And then I just wanted to highlight a major policy question that we'll be grappling with is what are the amendments to current rules, speaking of that, and what guidance materials are needed for our cities and our local jurisdictions to do this urbanization related work, and what would support them in pursuing processes like an urban growth boundary amendment or a land swap and exchange, or creating urban or rural reserves in their community where needed. And all of this is sort of a balancing duality of goals to generally make the process much more accessible. And we talked about, a lot of folks brought up municipal capacity, staff capacity. How do we create a more accessible process, provide additional analytical flexibility? It isn't one size fits all for every community. Also supporting the needed analysis so you have a very defensible urban growth boundary amendment process or an urbanization process, really mitigating and limiting that risk of appeal for jurisdictions that go into this work. I also wanted to highlight a little bit the timeline on this. We do have a different timeline than the other two focus areas. So we've been asked by the legislature to bring adopted language by January 1st, 2026. So you can see our timeline is quite a bit extended. I think at this point, we can go to some of the policy questions or the discussion questions here. And Ben, are we able to poll some folks that might want to share what they have on your board or need clarification for anything the three of us?
100%. Yeah. So let's do that. So again, I'm going to encourage folks that we haven't heard from to bring your voice into the room. But I think there's a lot on the board that's worthy of speaking to, and some of the complexities and intersections that folks have named in earlier parts of our conversation certainly show up here around infrastructure and the relationship with transportation and livable neighborhoods and natural resource protection and proximity. So let's open it up. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Kasara, please.
All right, I'm going to jump on the infrastructure bandwagon here. Just wanted to note that, over the decades, I think we've seen a significant decrease in federal funding for infrastructure. And over that time, we've expected new development really to kind of pay for itself in terms of infrastructure. So when I looked at those kind of criteria for, what is development ready, there are CIP projects, but the development community actually, builds a lot of infrastructure, particularly in the expansion areas. So just wanted to kind of note their role and that they should be included in these conversations as well.
Thank you, Kasara. And do we all know? I mean, I think Shannon, I think it was you that said little I infrastructure. And I think you just talked about a road cut. Is that different? What's big I infrastructure? Is that like water, sewer, electric lines kind of thing? And little I is sidewalks and road cuts? Shannon, can you explain what you meant by little I infrastructure so we're kind of have some clarity here?
Yeah, I think we lovingly call them build killers in our habitat world, right? You go to get a permit and it's like, sure, you can get that permit after you install sidewalk through 6 other lots where you're trying to build this one duplex. It's like, you can't afford that, or you can build homes and this church wants to donate you land and it's a cool high opportunity area and you want to build there, and then you go to talk to the municipality and they're like, sure, right after you install a traffic light on the corner because you'll have more people living. It's like,
Okay, that's helpful. And so I'm assuming, so let's not lose, right, the little I infrastructure that you're referencing. That can be a barrier to some of these things. But my assumption then when other folks are talking about infrastructure, you're talking about big I infrastructure, water, sewer, electric, roads, major pieces, and not these, I don't want to say major, minor, but little I, big I. Okay, thank you, Shannon, for giving a real world illustration. Other thoughts? There's a lot of stuff on the board. Just want to invite folks in if there's anything you want to lift up. If you have questions or comments, clarity. Anne, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I guess you just saw me sort of fidgeting for my hand raised button.
I keep an eye out.
I love all this conversation, and I just think I'm thinking of the infrastructure thing too. I brought it up before, how it can be such a broad topic. I'm thinking of like middle housing land divisions, for example. Senate Bill 458 precludes us from requiring access as part of those. And that kind of translates to not being able to get road connections, which some people think is really important infrastructure. I actually appreciate the fact that we can't require through connections as part of these, because for very small ones, that can be something that makes development impossible. So there's kind of not always a black and white or a real clear cut way to say, let's get this real important infrastructure if it includes something like road connections, because we have other legislation that's also told us we can't do that. So let's be really clear about, how and what we're looking for in terms of infrastructure, and maybe, how many units might tip getting certain types of infrastructure versus not getting it.
Great, thanks, Ann. Ted?
Just a quick clarifying question. It sounded like the focus was going to be on estimating capacity on vacant and partially vacant lands, not so much redevelopment and infill. Is that correct, or?
I think that's part of our work with rulemaking, is to delve into both of those. It isn't an either or.
Okay.
Good, thank you, Ted. Otherwise, we'll keep the floor open if there's folks that want to add either on this piece, or we can start moving into our transition. Shannon, jump in.
Yeah, so this, maybe it's only keeping me up at night, maybe. But I'm so excited / stressed out by the Inflation Reduction Act resources that are going to be flowing from the federal government. And I feel like every day I turn around and it's like, oh, there's a fourth state agency that you have to talk to about these resources, right? Like, some is maybe through Energy Trust of Oregon, we can get energy efficient HVAC systems. But now I think I understand the Department of Energy might be able to help you with your sewers. And then over here, who can do that? As we go to increase our housing production, could we get some unified navigation? If you want to build this new thing and you need to put in these things, we're going to help you connect with these 4 state agencies who have unprecedented federal resources to help get this done. Or do we have to personally meet them all? It seems like it's the latter course right now.
Well, I'm not going to reflect on state agency process. Karen, you want to jump in?
I do not at all. I've worked for a state agency for all of 4 months, but I'm smiling, Shannon, because that's so common that I think the state is listening and taking that. And I actually, at the risk of using up a little bit of our precious time, Sean, a colleague of mine, I think Madi, Ethan, and Sean have been working on something along this. And Sean, maybe you could talk about, you started with accountability, but what a HAPO office might be able to assist with.
Yeah, no, and I won't spend too much time on this, just recognizing, right, this is talking about the future, right? I think we mentioned previously that this bill, House Bill 2001 and 2889, only focused on some of the legislative recommendations from the ONA report. One of the biggest ones was on that state coordination piece, right? Have some type of structure for coordination between these different state agencies, each of which touch a piece of the housing piece, including that infrastructure finance piece, federal money, right? All those different kind of components. So it's definitely an ongoing conversation. I think it's been kind of reintroduced as part of the recent legislative discussions, but right, it still is very much a legislative discussion at this time, right? So yes, it's absolutely, we've heard this and we've reflected it very much in our recommendations. We still think it's important, but it's definitely something we'll need to consider.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Karen. Any other thoughts on this? I know we've been together for 2 hours and 45 minutes, so I won't keep pushing you. Yeah, Kathleen, please jump in.
I just wanted to confirm that as things currently stand, an expansion of the UGB is appealable. There was some talk of it not being subject to appeal, and I didn't find out whether that's up in the next legislative session or where that stands.
Is that a Sean question? So it's whether UGB decisions are currently still appealable?
Yeah, so any kind of land use decision, right, is something that can be subject to appeal. That includes UGB amendments. I think one of our goals, one of our stated intents of the legislature is to give cities the tools and resources they need to kind of make sure that they have a very solid UGB amendment proposal. So that way we can avoid getting out of the litigious territory and into the implementation territory. So that is a goal. That is one of the things that we're going to be exploring in that. But there's nothing in this bill that exempts UGB's amendments from appeal.
Thank you, Sean. Does that answer your question, Kathleen? Okay, great. Thank you. Any last thoughts before I move us towards closing? Okay. Well, I'll name a couple things then, Ethan. I'm going to invite you in. We started at a very high level and we kind of moved through some depth of conversation. You all provided a lot of fodder for future work. And Ethan, I'd love to just give you a chance to come in to really talk about how we're going to connect these kind of high level visions and actually kind of build it into that initial two-circle slide you showed what seems like many hours ago. But if you could offer a little bit of reflection and kind of help us imagine the next steps, and then I can clarify some of the timeline pieces and help us close out.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I think, thank you all for that conversation. I think those kind of vision type conversations and thinking at that kind of high level about, how is this going to work and what are the special considerations that we should be making in these, three major buckets of work is really helpful. And it's necessary at this point in time to have those kind of get it all out there, so to speak, so that we can, begin to throughout this process, really the rulemaking process gets narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower as we move through the process. We think really high level. We think about how we can integrate those things into, policy option conversations and alternatives. And eventually at the end of this, we will have words on a page that tries to encapsulate all of those elements that we've just talked about. That's a tough task. So I just want to kind of put that out there. I think the conversation that was just had between Kathy and Sean about, how does this piece fit into this work, or does it not, or is it outside of this process, is a really good example of that, right? There are other policy conversations, other things that are taking place at this same exact time in terms of how do we make this process work better? How do we address these housing issues, housing production, underproduction, housing capacity, climate? All of those things are still central to the conversation that we're having, but there are elements of those conversations that are outside of our statutory authority and our obligations under this work. So our job as DLCD throughout this work is going to be to try to keep the focus on those statutory obligations while also bringing in those elements where we can and filtering those conversations and those suggestions and principles and direction paramount, and filtering those policy options through all of that, right? And so, this is kind of, I guess, a call to you all to continue to bring, those to the table and to this forum, because we're not going to be able to make good on those principles and those priorities if we don't continue to have those kind of conversations. And in terms of kind of next steps, like where we go from here in this conversation, we've got a couple things. We've got the post-meeting survey that I encourage you all to take back to both your organizations and constituents and whatever the case may be, to continue to have those conversations and bring those additional comments through either the post-meeting survey or through the Miro board, which we'll keep open. But when we get into our next series of meetings in March of 2024, we're going to, have to get down into the, policy conversations a little bit more, stay, in those three topic areas, and think kind of maybe a less visiony, less bigger picture, and kind of, get down into some of those specifics we keep talking about. We're going to, for the purpose of these few first meetings, we have to stay high level. In March of 2024, we're diving in. So I'm really looking forward to that, and that conversation with you all. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. You named a couple things. We might have a closing slide, but just reminding folks that there is the drop-in session. We really encourage, especially if you're feeling like we're having conversations that are introducing topics or complexities that you haven't spent a lot of time with, please utilize that space and take advantage of the wisdom, expertise of some of our subject matter experts in the agencies. As Ethan said, we're going to be taking a break here between now and March. There'll be plenty of action if you want to, I guess, look at the short session and track work happening there. But certainly we'll be coming back in March. And so the more you can contribute, both to Ethan's point, to the survey, we'll keep the Miro board open for some time. We'll eventually close it off, but certainly if you want to take the next, 24, 48, 30, I can't do the math beyond 48, 72 hours, then please continue to add to that. We'll use it to help prepare how we enter our next conversations, really informed by some of the things that you're naming now, that we know we have to grapple with and bring into our conversations in the future. And then the only other thing I would ask, as you probably realize and witness, really just, we've had 2 meetings now, right? And I'll really embrace any feedback you all can also give on how do we make these meetings spaces where each and every one of you feel like you can bring your voice into the room. So whether that's structural, whether that's technical, or whether it's really feedback for me as a facilitator, I hope you all will give the gift of that feedback, so we can ensure that each and every one of you can feel like you can come in with full agency and really bring your important voice into the conversation. So I ask that with all humility and with hope that you all will give feedback where it's most helpful, so we can design a process that not just meets the kind of legislative direction and statutory requirements, but actually results in something where each and every one of you can walk out of this saying, I had a great experience. I felt like I was able to contribute in meaningful ways. And we've really kind of rose up to the values that I think we want to hold in this process. So any last questions or thoughts or comments for the good of the order? Okay. Well, as any facilitator will embrace with joy, it's 3:52, 8 minutes before our closing time. Much love to you all. Thank you for the gifts that you give, and the conversation was wonderful. It's a great privilege to be in the room with you all. So we'll see you in March, and there'll be work between, and you know where to find us if you have questions or any needs between now and then. So enjoy the rest of your day, and really great to be with you. Take care.
Thank you.